Hello and welcome to my worst books of 2022. This is one of my favorite videos to make, hello Spleen, because it's so low stakes, because like it doesn't matter. I don't care how I'm really portraying these books because I didn't like them, so it doesn't matter. But yeah, like just caveat on this video that I always do, reading is subjective. Just because I don't like something doesn't mean you won't, etc, etc. Yeah, but I have 10 books for this list, most of which I do not have for obvious reasons. I was trying to narrow it down to have a shorter video, but like I got it down to 10 and that was about the best that I could do here, which kind of makes sense because I read 147 books in 2022, so it kind of makes sense that like my worst and best of the year list will be like slightly higher than normal since I read a slightly higher amount of books than normal. So I'm gonna get into this. These books are ranked from what annoyed me the least to what annoyed me the most, so I'm just gonna get more like irritated as the video goes along. I don't really have like a good way to judge these. I literally just like read through the list of all the books I read last year, and whatever I feel like deserves to be on this video gets put in the video. So yeah, I'm gonna get into this. The first book, or I should say like the 10th book, the 10th least bad, the 10th most bad, I don't know. The 10th most annoying book of 22, The Forever War by Joe Haldeman, which is a science fiction classic that is essentially an allegory of the Vietnam War. It deals a lot with like time dilation. I'm not looking at my reviews for these because I don't care, so if I'm explaining them horribly, so be it. This deals a lot with like time dilation. They are fighting a war against aliens. The main character, I don't remember his name, but it was basically an anagram for Joe Haldeman. He got drafted into like the first round of the war, and because there's a lot of space travel, there's a lot of like time dilation, and like he'll arrive one place having only gone through like a week of his life. And then by the time he gets there, though, like 30 years have passed. So it deals a lot with like culture changing, and it's, you know, an allegory for the Vietnam War. So there's a lot of commentary there. And when I read this, I thought it was going to be a lot higher on my list because this really irritated me at the time that I read it. But I feel like that's kind of faded because the things that I remember now are the Vietnam allegory and a lot of the interesting commentary that Joe Haldeman had that like I did think was like interesting commentary. However, the book was garbage. The writing was garbage. The storytelling was garbage. The characters were garbage. It was super sexist. Oh, I hated it because like the time dilation thing, he would skip 30 years, sometimes more. Sometimes it would be like 200 years and he'd be like, wow, so much time has passed. I have no idea what the world is like now because this took place over like 1,000 years of war. And then people would just come up and be like, oh, let me summarize it for you real quick. And it didn't actually show a lot of him like dealing with the cultural changes. It was just like, here are the cultural changes, figure it out, and like that was it. Not a fan. It was one of those books that like it could have been so good because I really did like a lot of the things he was bringing up because like very interesting concepts, because it was basically like time dilation was essentially what these soldiers were going through, but it's like a similar thing in Vietnam. Like you spend a year over there and come back, and it's not like 100 years of society have come and gone, but you've changed in the war, and like society has changed slightly, and you just don't fit in society anymore. Like interesting commentary, terrible book. The next book is Nickel and Dimed by Barbara Ehrenreich. This is a nonfiction book about a woman, I think this was early 2000s, it's a little bit aged, who worked the minimum wage. I mean, she didn't. She basically was a wealthy female writer, journalist, whatever, and she decided she wanted to live under the minimum wage and see what it was like and see if she could make it work and like see if she could make like rent and expenses work, and like she would just go and get a minimum wage job and then work that for a month and try to like write about her experiences. I didn't enjoy this. It was like interesting concept, but the whole book just reeked of privilege. And like, I mean, like obviously because she is like a I mean, I don't know how wealthy, but like at the very least comfortably middle class, basically pretending to be poor. And I think there was a way it could have been done where she could have really illustrated like what people go through, but in large part it just didn't work. Like it felt like a rich person cosplaying as a poor person, and it wasn't like sensitively done. It was kind of just like, oh, I'm gonna pretend to be poor for a few weeks. And it was just like she was constantly patting herself on the back for doing such a good job and like getting through her work days, and like it was so irritating to read. And then by the end of the book, she was working at Walmart in the last place because she did like a month at each place, which, like, by the way, she didn't actually do a whole month. She gave herself a month to find a job, find a place to live, and then work out the rest of whatever was left in the month. She didn't actually like work the whole month to see if the bills could work. So I don't understand, like, the experiment itself was flawed, which irritated me. Like, whatever. Unimportant, but irritating. But the last place she worked was Walmart, and she was working there for several weeks, and she was very irritated by it because, like, working retail sucks. And she's decided, like, she wanted to, like, get people to unionize, but she didn't actually do anything. Like, this is a woman who has privilege, who has the money, who has the means, who has the connections as a journalist to actually make some change. And all she did was kind of, like, hang out on her smoke breaks outside and be like, hey, you heard of unions? Unions are pretty cool. And that was it. Like, if you're gonna do that, like, you have the actual power to do something about it if she had decided to do that to end her experiment. And, like, she didn't. Like, it irritated me. Like, what is the point? Like, what was the actual point of this whole thing? I didn't like it. I feel like this book did more harm than good. Not a fan. Then I have Children of Nazis by Tania Krasnianski, which is another nonfiction book. I think the last on this list? No, unfortunately. Another nonfiction book. This is about children of Nazis. It basically is profiles on, I think, 10 children of, like, 10 famous Nazi figures, like Mengele, Himmler, etc., etc., and basically who they were and who the children were, like, who they grew up to be, like, what their lives were like, if they were kind of, like, on the side of their fathers, like, defending their fathers, or if they came out the other side, you know, and were, like, very anti-Nazi. This book had zero information, basically. You could read the Wikipedia page of these famous Nazi men and go to the personal lives section and read that and basically get the same amount of information as was in this book. Like, there just wasn't enough for this book to exist. And it was, like, such an interesting concept. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh, this is why all the books like this are fiction, because this information isn't available. Like, you know, you look at these children of famous Nazis and you're like, if your father was a famous Nazi who was just, like, universally hated by the entire world, you're probably not going to be a public figure. Like, you are probably going to live a very private life, which most of these kids did. And I mean, kids, like, they were adults, obviously, and most of them have since passed on. Or all of them? I don't know. But, like, they were all very, well, for the most part, they were very private figures. So it's just like, Tania Krasnianski couldn't get this information. Like, it just is not available to write about. So, like, there was no information in the book, and it was just such a waste of time. The Girl Who Chased Away Sorrow, The Diary of Serenita, a Navajo Girl, by Anne Turner. This is a Dear America book. It's a middle grade historical fiction diary. This one is set in 1864 about the Navajo removal and everything that goes along with that. I usually love these books. Like, I don't go into them expecting them to be, like, 100% historically accurate. Like, they're books for children. Like, I kind of expect it to be, like, some things are glossed over. Like, it's more about the personal story of the character in the book, which is fine. Like, this is the first book that I haven't actively liked and wouldn't recommend, and it made this list. I don't know how, but Anne Turner somehow managed to write a book about genocide that made the genocide look not that bad. Like, I don't know how. Like, It's about the Navajo removal. Like, these people are being rounded up by soldiers, murdered, marched to reservations and military camps, and just like dumped there under military guard. Like, they're starving to death, they're being shot and murdered, they're being left in the snow because they can't walk anymore, they're being marched to death. And somehow this book made it seem not that bad. I don't know how, but it was just like so belittling of what they went through, and so just like focused on the white soldiers' kindness. Like, there was one soldier that was kind of nice to them, and they were like, oh my god, the white people aren't all bad, let's thank the white people for all the help they give us. And it's like, you just had a soldier shoot a pregnant woman for beginning to give birth, and we're thankful that the one soldier like showed them how to use flour to make bread. Like, unimpressed by this. Yeah, and it's also funny because probably my second least favorite of these books that I've read recently has also been written by Ann Turner, so I'm thinking that Ann Turner and I just don't get along. And also, I didn't really want to focus on this because I don't know that much about this time period in history, but I was reading a lot of like criticisms of this book online, and I was feeling like this was not very historically accurate, and basically people agreed and were like, yeah, no, this is terribly inaccurate to history and to like Navajo culture. And apparently even like the name like Serenita, that would not be her name in this time period. Like, that was not a name that the Navajo would have used at that time. So people in general are very displeased with this book, and I concur. The Coincidence of Callie and Kayden by Jessica Sorensen. This is a new adult romance about a girl who was raped and a boy who was physically abused by his father, and they fall in love. This book is basically just trauma dumping. It's like, look at these two broken people and they fall in love together. And it's just like, you gotta deal with the trauma if you're gonna do that in a book. Like, I like reading really sad books. I read a lot of books that deal with all kinds of trauma and like all kinds of like rape has happened, abuse has happened, like whatever. But it's like, if you're gonna have that in a book, you actually have to deal with it. Like, you have to actually like work to handle like the sensitive matters sensitively. You have to actually develop those things. You can't just be like, oh look, these two people are so broken, look at all the sad and tragic things that have happened to them, now they're gonna love each other and heal each other and live happily ever after. Which, like, I don't actually know if they got to that point, because apparently this is a series. I read the first book and I knew it was a series, but like, usually it doesn't really matter. Like, you get enough from the first book if you don't want to continue on. This book just stopped at a point. Like, there was no happily ever after, which is fine, but there was no happily for now. Usually in romance novels that are serious, focusing on like a main couple, like throughout the series, not like different people, you get a little happily for now. Like, they have overcome the first of many struggles, and you end on a kind of optimistic note of like, there's more to come, but we have accomplished something. This book just stopped in like the middle of a serious scene. It was just like, okay, book's over now, continue on to book 2. Like, there was no closure, there was no happily for now, there was no like nothing accomplished, there was no ending. The book just kind of like stopped, and like, we were kind of in the middle of a couple of important things, and I don't know what happened here. I was not the only one that thought this, because I read some of the other reviews and people were like, what was that ending? Like, why would you do this in a romance novel? I mean, it was a terrible book besides that. I hated the main characters. I hated their like trauma and whatever. And like, I hated the constant like, oh, look at these broken people, they're in love, they're gonna heal each other. Like, if you're gonna have tragedy in your books, you gotta actually deal with the tragedy. You can't just use that as a stepping stone for like healing. Like, it doesn't work like that. Like, you have to deal with the trauma. You can't just... It irritated me a lot. So we're halfway through, which means we're now in the bad half of the books that continue to get worse. A Good Neighborhood by Therese and Fowler. Oh, I got an arc of this, and this was rough. This... Oh god, what was it about? Like, I don't even remember at this point. Like, it's been so long, and that book was so bad, I just like blocked it out of my memory. This was about an interracial relationship in the suburbs. Very religious white girl, black boy with a single mom. They fell in love-ish. They had kind of a relationship. And her father got really upset, or her stepfather, I don't remember. And her stepfather was a very controlling creep, and it was basically about, like, racism and, like, in the suburbs in modern day, you know, like, I don't know, it was trying to deal with that. It did not deal with it particularly well. The best review I saw of this book likened it to your aunt who goes on and on about the lovely gay couple she sees at the gym and how accepting she is. And, like, that was the best review I've seen of this book. It was not handled well. It was, like, constantly patting itself on the back for being anti-racist while also, like, not being anti-racist. Like, I've never read a book about racism that was so, like, evil versus good, you know? Like, there's so much nuance that could have been developed here, and it was kind of just like, this is the bad guy. Everyone else has been swayed by the bad guy, and they may be flawed people, but in the end of the day, they're lovely individuals who just need to learn a little bit. Except for that one evil bad guy who's racist. And it was just, like, the most written by a white woman book about racism I've ever read. It was so awful. And then, like, beyond that, the actual writing style was terrible. It had this weird section of, like, writing in first person plural from, like, the point of view of the neighborhood, which was really weird and did not work. It was so jarring in the book. Like, I've read first person plural and it can be done beautifully. Jeffrey Eugenides did it in The Virgin Suicides and I love it there. But in this book, it was so jarring. It didn't work because it didn't feel like the neighborhood actually had a voice. Like, it wasn't about the neighborhood. It was just Therese and Fowler trying to show off the fact that she wasn't racist. And the book started with an author's note where she was like, I went to a Zadie Smith talk once and someone asked if, like, white people could write black characters, and she said, do your research. So I'm allowed to write this book, which just gave me the worst vibes possible. I'm paraphrasing because it's been, like, months, but that was basically the gist of it. And I was, oh, this was bad. This was, like, one of the most unpleasant things I've read this year, just, like, to the point where I don't get pleasure from talking about how much I hate it. I just want this book to stop existing. Holidays on Ice by David Sedaris. This is thoroughly unpleasant. I like David Sedaris sometimes. I feel like most of the time he kind of oscillates between annoying and amusing for me. Like, I've read a few of his books, and usually he's got a couple of essays in his books that I find amusing, and then, like, the rest of them, like, half the book is, maybe more than half the book, is kind of annoying. But, like, there's usually enough in his books that I enjoy reading them, and I'll give him, like, 3 stars, but, like, for the few essays I really enjoy, he's worth it for me. So I read this, and I was like, this will probably be a fun time, because I knew the Santaland Diaries were in this, and, like, he's very well known for that. I never read that. Yeah, the Santaland Diaries were the only thing in this that even felt like an essay. The rest of it was just, like, absolute garbage. Like, I had such an atrocious time reading this, and it's so short. Like, I didn't understand that I could hate something that was this short and took up this little time, but, like, it was so unpleasant. Like, you have the Santaland Diaries, which, like, I didn't actually enjoy, because A, it was pretty boring. Like, as someone who's worked customer service and retail and stuff like that, like, he didn't have really interesting stories going on. He just had kind of generic, like, this is what it's like working retail every day. Like, it wasn't funny. It was just kind of like the generic stories. Like, I've had managers and stuff tell me way better stories that they had than that one. And also he had some really creepy lines in it about, like, he liked the job because you could see, like, the young high school and college kids, like, half naked in the changing rooms. And I was like, that's freaking creepy considering you're in your 30s, my dude. Like, what's that about? So I didn't really enjoy that one. But that's not why this is on the list, because the really bad thing about this book was every other essay in it that just got progressively worse. I was like, oh, well, that one was bad, but I'm sure it'll get better. And it just got worse. These weren't even nonfiction. Like, I'm not entirely certain I can call this a nonfiction book, because some of the essays were just, like, I don't know, satirical short stories. I don't really remember them. One was in the form of a Christmas letter where a woman was writing a Christmas letter about like, oh, like what's happened this year? Let me catch you up on all our family stuff. And like her husband had an illegitimate daughter from like Thailand or something who she kept calling like a slut, which was really racist, which was the point. So like it gets a pass for being racist when it's about racism. And like one of her daughters was like addicted to drugs, and like her child was born addicted to heroin or something, and like her grandchild, so like she has custody of the grandchild, and then like it just like keeps like escalating until you realize that like the woman writing this letter is legitimately crazy. And it's just like, okay, why? Like I get that it's satire, but it's not funny, so like why am I reading this? And then there's one essay about like two families who live in like a wealthy neighborhood who keep like one-upping each other on like their gift giving. And it kind of starts out like, oh, like we gave our kids like a TV, we gave our kids a car, until it turns into like, we gave away our house, like we gave away our kidneys, we gave away our hearts, and now we're dead. Like, you know, kind of like cartoonishly over the top. But like, again, I understand that it's satire, but like, what was the point? I don't know. This was so unpleasant and so nothing. And I truly do not understand. Like, I don't always get along with David Sedaris' humor, but usually I'm like, okay, like that essay wasn't great, but like overall I like him. And this was the first one where I was like, I don't know if I like David Sedaris at all anymore. And now I'm concerned about reading anything else he's ever written. And the final 3 books are my 3 1-stars of the year, because I had 3 1-star reads this year. So my 3 1-star reads top the list as like the most awful of the most awful. In 3rd place, Jane Green's Tempting Fate. This is an adult contemporary about a woman in a happy marriage of 18 years with 2 teenage daughters who cheats on her husband with a young hot billionaire, and then she gets pregnant and her husband has had a vasectomy. So obviously she either has to get an abortion of the much wanted 3rd child or admit to her husband that she cheated on him. And the book kind of goes from there. This was the most superficial thing I may have ever read in my life. Like, I do not understand like what the point of this was. I really thought this was gonna like dive into the complex emotions of why this woman had an affair, like what she was seeking outside of her marriage, like what she was missing as a person. She felt old. The dude was young and hot. Brief affair. Then she felt a little bit of guilt and shame over the fact that she cheated on her husband. And then she loved her baby very, very much. Like, that was this entire book. Like, it's 330 pages of that. Like, how? Like, nothing happened. This book had no depth. Like, it felt like it was just, like, reciting the action that was going on and, like, what people were saying and doing, and not actually delving into what people were feeling, apart from, like, oh, she felt a little bit of guilt. Her husband felt kind of betrayed. Her daughters were, like, kind of upset, and then they realized the dude was a billionaire, and they were, like, less upset, which, like, valid, to be honest. But, like, there's so much in this book that could have been delved into. Like, her husband got a vasectomy without telling her, knowing that she wanted to desperately have a 3rd child. Like, you could have spent so much time on this and just, like, delving into her complex feelings and everything she thought. And, like, no, she's kind of upset. And then she gets pregnant, and then it's fine. And then the ending was, like, the most, like, heartwarming ending. Like, oh, it made me so mad. Like, you can have heartwarming endings after, like, rough books where people are very upset. But the characters have to actually get there. Like, there has to be some growth or development to get to the point where, like, bad things have happened. They're now working towards their heartwarming ending. And there has to be, like, a journey. There was no journey. The characters are very upset, and then at a point where, like, but I kind of like the way things used to be. So let's just go back to that. And, like, kind of just disregard everything that happened in the last year. And I'm like, she has a baby. How are you just disregarding? Like, this book was so nothing. Like, I just don't understand. This was absolute garbage. The only reason this is not higher is because it was a super quick read. And the other 2 books were just, like, a struggle to get through and such a time commitment that, like, this kind of was lucky to get in 3rd place. In 2nd place, Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson. This is a sci-fi book, perhaps a sci-fi classic. I think it's maybe a little bit recent to be called a classic, but like, we'll say classic. Much beloved sci-fi that I apparently just hate. I do like sci-fi, I just have had bad luck with sci-fi this year. So this is a book about essentially a computer virus that can be programmed into humans. And also there is a Scientology L. Ron Hubbard cult thing going on. It's not literally Scientology, but like, what's the dude's name? I didn't write down his name, but his name is like very similar to L. Ron Hubbard, so it was very obviously meant to be L. Ron Hubbard. It's like cool general concept, but this book opened with the protagonist. His name is Hero Protagonist, which I guess is funny if you like that kind of thing, delivering a pizza. 15-page description of him delivering a pizza, which was probably the best part of the book because everything else got worse after that. It was so unpleasant to read. There was so much exposition and just like long descriptions of nothing, like things that didn't matter. At the ending, there was like this really long section just like describing the entire book up to the point we have gotten, like explaining what the L. Ron Hubbard character has been doing this whole time, explaining the whole backstory, and I mean things we've already read. Like, I read an entire book to understand all of this, and then it's condensed into 20 pages of dialogue of the main character informing the mafia boss caricature and the racist Chinese stereotype caricature of everything that's happened. Literally 20 pages of dialogue. At one point I counted, and there were 8 straight pages of dialogue where there was one dialogue tag in those 8 pages of dialogue. Like, this is not an exaggeration. I counted. One dialogue tag in 8 pages of dialogue. No description, no other dialogue tags. The only thing in those 8 pages that wasn't dialogue was Ing says. And like, that was it. It was so painful to read. I thought about DNFing this book so many times, and I kept thinking like, oh, it'll get better. At some point, I will reach the part of this book that is worthwhile, that makes me understand why this is a classic. So I just kept going, and kept going, and kept going, and it just like got worse the entire time. It was so painful to read, and it took me so long to read because it's a dense book. The only like positive thing I could say was that it did do some interesting things with virtual reality. Like, if you care about that, I don't in my books. So like, the fact that there were cool ideas about virtual reality, not really my thing, not really anything I cared about. And also, there was this whole gross, creepy rape scene of like this 15-year-old and this adult man, and like, it was the most written by a man sex scene I've ever read. And I read Ken Follett this year, so that says a lot. It was just like, she was 15 and kind of into him, but it was also like a super rapey scene. Like, I'm not entirely certain she consented, and also she was 15 and he was an adult. So like, regardless, that's rapey as anything. And then she just like orgasmed the second his dick touched her. And I'm like, this is not how sex works. Like, why do men write this so often? It drives me crazy. Like, okay, first of all, rape. Second of all, no, like, foreplay is a thing. Like, this is, why do men do this? Like, so many times male authors do this, and I have never read a female author who did this. Why? Like, do men think this is what sex is like? I'm confused. But this book was terrible. I hated this. This was so unpleasant. I actually unhauled another Neal Stephenson book that I had purchased prior to reading this because I just could not suffer through any more of his writing. Like, I couldn't do it. It was so bad. And my number 1 worst book of 2022, Scruples by Judith Krantz, which is a 1978 romance, Hollywood, gossipy nonsense, nothing of a story. I read this early in the year, so I actually did look up my review and look up a description of the book, because I'm pretty sure I've just blocked this entire book out of my head. This is like one of the most painful things I've ever read. I was reading it for a video, and I think the only reason I didn't DNF it was because I was reading it for a video and I really wanted to finish it, and I just struggled so bad. Like, every word of that book was painful to get through. Like, I would just bribe myself with candy to get through like 4 pages. I feel like if I read 4 pages, I can have a Jolly Rancher. Like, it's fine. I can get there. And like, I eventually did. But this was painful to read. First of all, it had such a wide scope, and I don't actually know what this book was about. Like, it was about all these different people who worked in like a boutique clothing store in Hollywood, and I mean like high-end, like dressing people for the Oscars type clothing store, but it didn't actually have anything to do with the Oscars. And the woman who owned the shop was like super rich. She had like an ugly duckling childhood with like being like the poor relative of like really rich people, and then like went to France and kind of like got skinny and beautiful and suddenly wealthy. Huzzah. And then it had to do with the French dressmaker and her life, and then some dude who worked in the shop who, I don't know what his job was, basically just like telling women they were beautiful. That was, as far as I could figure out, that was all he did. And like, it was just about them, but like largely about the shop and like how the little clothing boutique came to be and how it functioned. And like, it seemed like that was the main part of the story. Like, it reminded me of when I was kids and like playing with Legos with my brother, and like we would spend like 4 hours just like setting up all the Legos to go to war, and like never actually go to war. The fun was in like the setup and like the planning for the war. Like, that's what this book reminded me of. So like, maybe like fun to write, but so unpleasant to read, and it was so nothing. And I don't know, I didn't care about the romance. I don't even remember the romance or who ended up together. Like, I think the dressmaker and the one dude who was like paid to compliment women, I think might have ended up together. And I think there might have been a romance with the really rich woman, because she married an old guy who died, and then she had a bunch of sex with other dudes who may or may not have been important. I don't remember. I just like, and this isn't all like time having gone by. This is like, I didn't understand what I was reading as I was reading it. It was so long and so pointless and so painful to get through. Like, I don't know why I didn't DNF it. I should have DNF'd it. Like, all I can think about is when I'm thinking about this and Snow Crash, I should have DNF'd them both. Like, they were both just awful to get through. Whereas at least Snow Crash had like a point. Like, it had no character development and like terrible writing, but at least it had like a story, whereas Scruples didn't even have that kind of. It was the life of this clothing boutique that I really didn't care about. All the characters were annoying. Everything that happened in the book was annoying. Like, I don't know. I'd really love to give more details on the Scruples to really explain my hatred of that book, but like, to be honest, I've just completely blocked that out. Like, I have no memory of 90% of that book, because it was so long and it was such a drag, and every second of it was just like, why was this written? Why was this published? Why was this bought and read and beloved? Like, I don't know. I don't even know why I bought it. Like, it does not look like a book that I would buy, but I did at some point. It's off of my shelf, so at least there's that. So these were the 10 worst books I read of 2022. Let me know down below if you've read any of these, what you thought of them, if you have, if you like to commiserate with me and my pain, especially of the last 2, because those were like 2 of the most atrocious things I've read in a really long time. I would like to say I have still never read a book that is worse than The Pleasures of Men by Kate Williams, which I read like 4 years ago, I think, or 3 years ago. I read it years and years ago, and that book is always just like my bar of the worst thing ever written, and I don't think I've surpassed that this year. So congratulations to Kate Williams for keeping her spot as the worst thing I've ever read. But yes, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.